Alrighty, hello everybody. We are going to be moving on to chapter 6 today. So we're actually skipping over chapter 5 for various reasons, but more so to kind of stay on track and make sure we give you some time for your projects. I will be providing project feedback. You should be getting that, or your outline feedback, shall I say. You should be getting that within the next couple of days. And so hopefully you followed instructions. So I've looked at a few, and you all want to make sure that you are paying attention to what I'm asking for in those lecture videos, so that you are giving me, exactly what, I instructed you to give me in that last lecture video from last week. So just be expecting that here shortly. I'll probably do some sort of like video or voice feedback in Canvas. And so we'll just kind of see how that goes. All right. So again, we're moving on to chapter 6 this week for various reasons. Chapter 6 is on deviance, and deviance is one of my favorite chapters to study because it usually kind of shatters folks' idea of, what deviance is and what, who defines what criminality is and how, criminal behavior changes over time, like what's considered criminal changes over time. And so the first kind of term we will make sure to understand when we're talking about deviance is this idea of social control. So every social institution, and social institutions are like, government is a social institution, education is a social institution, like every system that we operate within in our society is considered a social institution when we're talking about sociology. So they're defined by their social control. So social control specifically are techniques and strategies for presenting undesirable behavior in any society. And so in every aspect of how we interact with, whether it's going to the DMV, right? Hopefully you all have had that experience of going to the DMV, but there's very specific rules that you're supposed to follow, right? You take your ticket, you wait in line, when it's your turn, your ticket's called, then you stand up and go to the counter. That is all social control. That's a form of social control, because what happens if you violate that, they will let you know, right? You'll either not get serviced, or you'll be quickly reminded by the security or the workers that you're supposed to be doing things in a very particular manner. And that can kind of be taken in any aspect. And kind of my favorite to talk about, obviously, is education. Our education system, K through 12, so kindergarten up through high school, up through your 12th grade year, is very much defined by their ability to control, right? So there's behaviors that you're supposed to follow when it comes to passing periods, right? You have a given amount of time, once that bell rings, you have this X amount of time to get to your classroom. And if not, there's consequences, right? You get a tardy slip, or you get, say, I remember having to go to the attendance office all the time to get a pass in order to go to class. So it's kind of taking time out of, you're already late, right? You're running late, it happens. It's something that some of us may or may not be able to avoid in some mornings. And yet when you're late, you have to go to the attendance office. So it makes you even more late, right? Because then you have this line of people waiting outside. Everyone's there to get a pass that basically says, yeah, I'm late today, right? I always found that specific policy to be very interesting, but that's a form of social control, right? Because what happens if you go to class, a little bit after the bell rings, but you don't have that tardy slip, right? You don't have that slip that says, I'm late and I went to the attendance office, right? Your teacher will then send you to the attendance office. Thus kind of, again, removing you from the classroom, taking more time out of, your classroom experience. And there's many examples that that we can give in regards to how the K through 12 system operates under this really strong aspect of social control. And so when we talk about social control, there's two different kinds and then one kind of example. So obedience and conformity are examples of social control, right? There are two different forms of social control. Obedience is compliance with higher authorities in a hierarchical structure. So this is in regards to their position in comparison to you. So if you're a student, right, you're expected to comply with your teachers, your principal, vice principal, right? All the people who have a higher status or authority than you as a student, right? If we're expected to obey as citizens, we're expected to obey police officers, right? Because they have a higher authority position in society than we do. They've been given this ticket, this pass to control the way in which people engage in our everyday interactions in our society. And so on the other hand, conformity is the act of going along with individuals of our own status, right, who have no special right to direct our behavior. So that is still a form of social control, but the difference is they don't have, people who you're conforming to or with don't necessarily have a higher status than you. So a lot of us conform to particular behaviors in our friend groups, in social clubs, like student clubs and things like that, fashion trends. All of those are very particular aspects of conformity, because it's not like you have to listen to your friend groups, right? It's not that they say, oh, let's ditch class today, and you have to follow along. You're conforming because you are wanting to kind of be a part of the group, which kind of brings us to this idea of groupthink. So groupthink is the tendency for highly cohesive groups to make poor decisions because they do not want to threaten group solidarity. So groupthink is that exact example. So all your close friends, right? And this happened to me, I can't tell you how many times in high school. I loved like the learning experience, didn't necessarily love my learning environment, right? So there's definitely a big difference. I've always kind of been like the schoolgirl out of my friend group. So AP classes, very involved in my studies, but didn't necessarily like being in the classroom. Hopefully that makes sense. And a lot of that had to do with student-teacher dynamics, right? I was not necessarily the student that teachers respected off of the, I think a lot of us may be able to relate to that in regards to maybe not feeling heard on certain topics, or this expectation that you know less than your teachers because you're a student. So that was me a lot in class. But a lot of my friends, like, they like to ditch all the time, especially when it came to senior year, right? Some of them didn't have 5th or 6th periods. And we were a really highly cohesive group. Like, we had been best friends since middle school. So these are a group of people I didn't necessarily want to not be friends with. And so when they would decide, hey, let's skip 5th period today and go off campus, I would go along, right? Poor decision, knew it was a poor decision because I knew I should be in class. And yet, because I didn't want to kind of threaten that group solidarity or be called like, oh, Shantae, you're so lame, like, you're such a bookworm, whatever, I would go along with that, right? That's groupthink. That is groupthink. And that is, again, kind of another form or example of social control under the aspect of conformity. So under this overall umbrella of conformity. And so now, what is deviance, right? That's what this chapter is about. And it definitely goes along with this overarching term of social control. But deviance is behavior that violates the standards of conduct or expectations of a relatively powerful person, group, or society. And so it's really important to understand the most important sociological element of deviance is that people with the greatest status and power in a particular society define it. So I, as a like regular everyday person, don't have the power to go around telling people like wearing your hair in a ponytail is now deviant, right? You are not allowed to wear your hair in a ponytail. You cannot get a job if you wear your hair in a ponytail, right? Because I don't have that power, that status, that people will actually listen or feel like they have to follow along with what I'm saying. People in power, though, so I'm talking, obviously, our government is one of the most powerful institutions that we have, that we are required to listen to. They have the power to then say, if they wanted to, right? Okay, you're not allowed to get a job if you wear your hair in a ponytail. Everyone has to wear their hair down. And I know that's like a very simplistic example, but we have entire laws now kind of built around protecting natural hairstyles, right? So this was a thing, that having locks, right? So what people call dreads, but are definitely the proper term would be locks, or braids, which I braid my hair all the time. Or I don't braid it, but I get it braided all the time. At one point in time, and still currently in some states, that is considered not a professional hairstyle. Like wearing your hair in braids or locks is looked down upon. Wearing your hair in an afro is looked down upon, right? And in some spaces and in some states, actually not protected against discrimination. So for instance, California just recently, I think 2018, passed what's called the Crown Act, which basically says that employers cannot discriminate on natural hairstyles. So it doesn't matter if you want to be a waitress and you have locks, right? Or you want to be, I don't know, like a front office secretary and you have an afro, right? Because those were hairstyles that were very much like frowned upon. Like that's not professional, that's not very well kept, that's not something we want in our workplace. That was a thing, right? And so this idea of natural hair was and still is in some states, not California, but in some states, still considered a deviant form of like stylistic expression, like wearing your hair, right? And another kind of example of how deviance, definitely changes over time. What's considered deviant changes over time is, the marijuana laws, right? Back in the 80s, marijuana was like a very deviant drug, very deviant, to the point that we still have people in prison today who got locked up on very low level marijuana offenses. So for instance, going to, being caught with less than an ounce of weed on them and getting like 10 to 15 years in prison. Now, marijuana is legal, right? And that was done, that shift in the ideals of deviance in regards to marijuana happened because people in power, right? People in power at the state level, not the federal level, but the state level, decided that this was no longer going to be something that's deviant. It's now legalized in most states at this point, not on a federal level, but on the state level. And so that's just another kind of example of how deviance shifts over time, can be changed, can be altered. It also is assumed to be associated with different racial groups. And so there was this study done, and it's actually on YouTube if you're interested in watching, but it was called What Would You Do? What Would You Do? Car Vandals or something like that. And what they did, What You Do is a really cool show. What Would You Do? What Would You Do is the name of the show, actually. It's a really cool show. So they have actors kind of engaging in deviant behavior oftentimes just to see how the public is going to respond. And so what they did was they had 4 white actors in the middle of a park. I want to say it was in New York or somewhere like that, breaking into a car. So they were spray painting it, jumping on it, doing all kinds of things to the car. And as people walked by, they would just kind of, kids would be kids, like, hey, is this your car? No, it's not my car. Okay, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, right? But there was no police calls. No one called the police on them, right? And it's actually interesting because the one police car call that they did get was there was some Black teenagers sleeping in a car. Well, those Black teenagers were actually the next set of actors who, they switched out the race of the actors. So then they had these 4 Black teenagers doing engaging in the exact same behavior, vandalizing the car, jumping on the car, etc. They had, I want to say, like 5 or 6 calls to police, right? So there was this assumption that Black teenagers are more criminal, they're more dangerous when engaging in criminal activity, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of see this played out through movies, TV shows, the superhero and villain type of thing always kind of pops out, where you have the superhero or the villain is usually either darker skin, right? So a Black person and or dressed in Black, right? So like this association with Blackness and deviance has happened over time and continues to happen throughout TVs and movies, etc. And so kind of with that, and this is also really interesting to think about the ways that crime is categorized. And so we have different categories of crime that are also kind of associated with different levels of punishment. So index crimes are things like murder, forcible rape, so not statutory rape, but forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Those are considered index crimes. Those are those are the popular ones that you hear about that people are typically like punished harsher for, right? They're punished harsher for index crime. Then you have this thing called white collar crime. And I just find it no coincidence that it's called white collar crime. I don't. It was supposed to be this idea of like white collar was like the professionals, but also like white people are indicated within that. Illegal acts committed by affluent, high status, respectable people in the course of their occupations. You know, white collar crimes are things like embezzlement. So stealing in thousands or millions of dollars from companies is classified as white collar crimes. They cause far more financial harm than street crime. However, they're not punished as harshly, right? They're viewed very differently than these other crimes that, not to say that they're not harmful, right? But when we're comparing someone who, like, for instance, robbery, right? Say you robbed a gas station, stole a bunch of food, snacks, etc., right? You can get 10 plus years for that. Let's add up like how much money you actually, you caused harm, obviously, right? You caused harm, but the dollar amount that you kind of stole is maybe like $100, $200. White collar crime, stealing thousands, millions of dollars, oftentimes fraud, like committing fraud, all kinds of things that amount to a large sum of money, but they are more likely to get off with like probation and or paying a fine, etc. Then there's this thing called victimless crime. So when society uses criminal law to attempt to prohibit the exchange of strongly desired goods and services between willing adults. So this is things like prostitution and gambling. Victimless crimes are usually tied to our sense of morality, right? So gambling is not legal in every state. It's not legal in after a certain time, like after a certain time of day, right? Prostitution is technically not legal. I say technically because there are forms of what's considered prostitution or sex work that is actually allowed. So on the Las Vegas Strip, for instance, they do have a form of sex work that is allowed on the Strip only. And those are usually through things like brothels and things like that. And so they're definitely tied to our sense of morality. Meaning like right and wrong, like is it right, is it wrong? It's kind of up to how the person defines that particular crime, I guess you can say. And then organized crime is conducted by relatively large scale and highly structured gangs that routinely use corruption and violence to maximize profit. So this is usually the stuff you see on movies, right? This is the stuff you see on movies, people moving large amounts of drugs, using various gang resources, maybe tied into different political organizations oftentimes. And that is, again, kind of punished differently than the other crimes, right? Punished very differently than the other crimes. And so then there's these different theories, and these are all theories of the purpose of punishment. So it's the question of like, well, why do we punish people? So when someone commits a crime, why do we punish them, right? And there's 4 different kind of theories. And when I say theories, it just means like you could agree or disagree on any of these, right? These are definitely just perspectives and trying to understand why we punish people. So the first one is this idea of retribution, the belief that it is morally necessary for the offender to suffer, right? So if you commit a crime, that's kind of that eye for an eye type of thing. Like you committed a crime, you have to suffer now too, right? And it doesn't matter what the crime is. It doesn't matter what the crime is. This idea that we punish is we punish people under this under this idea of retribution just means that no matter what you did, you deserve to suffer. Deterrence, and this is kind of like the one that is more popularly like agreed upon by a wide amount of people, by a large amount of people, is based on the idea that we need to make the negative aspects of committing a crime outweigh the potential benefits of the offense. And so these are things like mandatory sentencing, which means there's mandatory sentencing for a lot of different crimes. But for instance, marijuana used to carry a mandatory sentence of 5 years. 5 years mandatory, no matter how much you get caught, no matter what the situation is, you got a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years, right? No matter what the situation was. You could have been holding it for a friend, right? And have no drugs in your system, and you still get this mandatory sentence. There's also like gun enhancement laws, right? That if you committed a crime and you had a gun on you, the gun automatically carries a 5-year sentence on top of whatever you get sentenced for the crime that you committed. And so the idea of this kind of tough on crime mentality that came out of the 80s and the Nixon administration was that if we make people scared, right? If they know, oh my gosh, if I do this, I'm going to get 10 years or life in prison, then they're less likely to commit that crime, right? That was the thought and the idea behind this idea of deterrence. The next one is rehabilitation. So argues that crime is not necessarily the fault of the individual, but of society. Therefore, we should be able to cure the criminal by teaching them skills while we are in prison. This is almost like a restorative justice maybe type of perspective. This is the closest to like a sociological understanding of that. If someone is selling drugs, right? Someone's selling drugs to make money, to feed their family. The person, the individual, yes, they had the choice. This is something they're choosing to do. So this is not saying that they had no choice, but why are they having to make this choice, right? They know this is illegal. They know that they can get in trouble, and yet they're still engaging in this sort of criminal, quote, quote, criminal behavior in order to feed their family. So the problem is then that we don't have, a social system of employment, of benefits, etc., that allows them to live in a way where they could provide for their family. So things like, what is a livable wage, right? So maybe they do have a job, and this is oftentimes the case, right? When people are selling drugs, it's not that they are just selling drugs because it's cool, right? It's oftentimes a last resort. Like, I have to put food on the table, and I can't get a job because maybe I have a felony record, or maybe whatever the situation may be. It's usually a very last resort type of response to, I have to make a living, right? And so this idea of rehabilitation is really understanding that societal structures are the problem. And so this is kind of where the prison reform or even prison abolition oftentimes idea kind of comes through, where people are saying, don't put people in prison just to punish them, like just for them to suffer. Put them in prison if they agree with putting them in prison, put them in prison because we want to teach them how to become productive people. So these are the prisons, and they do have prisons like this that offer like education programs within the prison, that offer work skill programs within the prisons that are teaching these skills while you're in prison, so that when you leave, you actually have the skills to go out and function and provide for your family, provide for yourself. Incapacitation, this is the death penalty one, essentially life sentences and death penalty. So centers on the idea that perpetual offenders should be locked up for the rest of their lives. So this is death penalty ideas. This is the 3-strike laws. So 3-strike laws are in most states that basically 3 strikes. So if you get caught, if you get a felony once, you get caught again, right? You automatically get charged with another felony. That 3rd time, and this doesn't matter what the felony is, right? It could be, I have my brother-in-law got a felony for jumping on cars, right? He was being a dummy, wasn't even 18 yet. So he got charged, as a minor, but he has a felony on his record. So the idea of incapacitation is like, well, if you do 2 more things, whether that's felony assaults, maybe you got into a fight and you really hurt somebody, maybe you got caught, with a little bit more marijuana on you than you should in a state that's not legal. That 3rd time that you get a felony or get caught, you're in prison for life. It doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter the circumstances. It doesn't matter the extent of the crime. Felonies are not all the same, right? This idea when you hear about a felony, it sounds so bad, right? You've been taught that, oh my gosh, felony record, like they deserve to go to prison forever. Felony, there's different degrees of felonies. Like there are definitely felonies that I personally believe should not be classified as felonies, right? Like my brother-in-law, who was 16 years old, jumping up, being a dummy. Like, yes, it was a dumb decision, but now he has this felony record and he's now 22, 23 years old with a felony on his record for being young and dumb, right? Being young and dumb. Should that be classified as a felony in the same way as someone who murders somebody, right? Like they don't distinguish felonies. Like once you have a felony, you have a felony. It doesn't matter what it was for. And that's kind of one of the problems personally for me when it comes to the classification of crimes and criminal behavior. So the last part of this lecture, we're just going to briefly go over some different theories, right? So there's the first theory is under conflict. So conflict theorists looks at this idea of strain. So strain is saying deviance is a result of blocked opportunities, right? So people commit crime because they have no choice. So they would look at gangs, for instance. Conflict theorists would look at gangs and say, well, you know, gangs, yes, they're typically found in poor neighborhoods, typically commit very low, regardless of what the news will have you thinking, typically commit very low level crimes such as selling drugs, money laundering maybe. And I'm not to say that none of this is bad, right? But when we are talking about crime and like harm done, gangs oftentimes even have benefits for their own community, right? They give back to the community. They, you know, give single mothers money, right? They're doing these things because they are not given the same access to. So maybe they grew up in this neighborhood that's very low income, isolated, no boys and girls clubs, no soccer teams, no, you know, all of these things that have been proven to, you know, like be able to keep you out of trouble, right? So the idea of blocked opportunity is that, you know, they're resorting to crime, they're resorting to what's considered deviant because they have no other choice, right? It's that example of like a mother stealing, you know, food for her children, right? Obviously she's stealing food for her children because she has no other option, right? She has to put food on the table. That's what a conflict theorist would look at under this thing called strain theory. A functionalist would look at this idea of disorganization theory. So disorganization theory attributes increases in crime and deviance to the absence or breakdown of cooperative relationships and social institutions. So that's kind of that example of like, you know, in affluent neighborhoods, right? You typically have a lot more like after school programs, soccer team, all of these things that are proven to be very functional to decreasing crime, right? If kids have something to do after school that their parents don't have to pay for, right? Because that's the thing, is like, yes, there are these other things, maybe in poor neighborhoods, but it costs like $500-600 to enroll your kid. Well, if you're living in a poor neighborhood and you're barely making it paycheck to paycheck, how are you going to put your kids into this soccer league, right? And so, you know, disorganization theory just says that neighborhoods with high crime rates, so high crime rates are usually poor neighborhoods, and it looks at, well, what are they lacking in those neighborhoods, right? They're lacking, you know, that community tie, that boys and girls club, those after school programs, those things that kind of keep people out of trouble. And then interactionist theory would look at this term called, there's two of them for interactionists. So the first one is differential association. So it says violations of rules results from exposure to attitudes favorable to criminal acts and is usually learned. So this is basically saying, if you grow up in a gang neighborhood, your family's in gangs, you know, you're more than likely going to start exhibiting those behaviors, right? It's that idea that we learn from our environment. We learn to function in the same way that we have been taught. And so as you interact with people, as you interact with your family, your cousins, your uncles, your mom, your dad, whoever, who are a part of these gangs for whatever reason, you are more likely to then be a part of those gangs, right? And the next one for interactionist theory is this term called labeling. Labeling theory looks at how the label of deviant is applied to particular people and the ways in which their identities influence their subsequent behavior. So for instance, when people get labeled a felon, right? Like how does society treat them? How do they then navigate their world based on this one label? And like, remember kind of touching back, felony, they don't distinguish what type of felony you have. My brother, I have a lot of members of my family who have felony records, but I've never actually harmed anybody. Never harmed anybody. And yet they have this label of a felon, which makes it difficult for them to get a job, makes it difficult for them, like disqualifies them from financial aid, right? If you have a felony record in a very particular category, like drugs and things like that, you cannot get financial aid to go to school, right? And so this label of a felon really influences the ways in which people interact with social institutions and navigate their social world. And so for your personal narrative, I want you to write on the purpose of punishment. So I want you to pick one of these four, right? What do you think the purpose of punishment should be? And tell me why, right? Tell me why. There's no right or wrong answer with this. This is, again, very much theorizing. Different countries have different ways of punishing people and their reasons for doing so. And so I want you to pick one of these four and explain to me why you chose this particular purpose of punishment. And so that is it for this week, y'all. I will again be looking out for my comments on your outlines, and yeah, have a good rest of your week.